Hello and welcome to Our American States, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. This podcast is all about legislatures, the people in them, the policies, process, and politics that shape them. I'm your host, Ed Smith.
The first major point is it's just so much money. Over a 5-year window, it's a total of about $43 billion.
That was Alan Roberson, the Executive Director of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. He's one of my guests on this podcast. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, signed by President Biden in November 2021, provided $1.2 trillion for roads, bridges, highways, broadband, water projects, and more. The $55 billion included for water projects is the largest single investment in water infrastructure in the nation's history. My first guest on the podcast is Kristen Hildreth, the Legislative Director for Natural Resources and Infrastructure at NCSL. She breaks down what's in the bill, how states will access the money, and some of the challenges, including matching funds in some areas. Roberson focuses on new money provided under the bill to address lead service lines and emerging contaminants. He explains the complexity of the lead service line programs and some significant challenges states and water system operators may encounter dealing with the PFAS contaminants. This is one of several podcasts this year focusing on the IIJA. Other shows will focus on energy, roads, bridges, and transit, and the expansion of broadband. Here's our discussion. Kristen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Glad to be here. I'm so excited to finally be on the renowned Our American States.
Well, we're very happy to have you. We're going to talk about money today, money that's included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, for water projects. But first, why don't you just take a minute to explain to listeners what your role is at NCSL?
Of course. I'm our Legislative Director for our Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee, where I advocate on behalf of states with Congress and the administration, primarily on environment-related issues. So my job includes identifying, monitoring, interpreting the full range of congressional and federal agency actions and policies that affect state governments, advocating effectively on behalf of states, and ensuring our members have the most up-to-date information they need on any federal action.
So let's turn to the IIJA. This included $55 billion in new funding for water via the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's the largest single investment in water infrastructure in the nation's history. I'm not sure everyone appreciates how much money that is, since so much of the focus in media was on transportation when this bill passed. I wonder if you can break down the water funding and explain how this might spur projects around the country.
Yeah, like you said, Ed, the funding that was included in the IIJA was historic. It was truly a transformational investment in the nation's water infrastructure. And that $55 billion in new water infrastructure broke down to around $50 billion for drinking water and wastewater specifically. And that breakdown was around $11.7 billion in supplemental funding for EPA's existing state drinking water state revolving fund, $11.7 billion in supplemental funding for its clean water state revolving fund, $15 billion for lead service line replacement projects via the existing drinking water state revolving fund mechanism, $10 billion for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, better known as PFAS, and other emerging contaminants via the existing drinking water state revolving fund, clean water state revolving fund, and its water infrastructure improvements for the nation's small and underserved communities, emerging contaminants grant program funding mechanisms. And as for how that funding might spur water projects, the national attention on the condition of the nation's water infrastructure and challenges faced by states and localities in maintaining such infrastructure, coupled with this significant expansion of funding, is certainly going to lead to the initiation of new projects and allow for the growth of some existing projects.
So you mentioned these state revolving funds, or SRFs, and as I understand it, the bulk of this money ends up going through that. Can you explain how those work, how those state revolving funds work?
Of course. So of that $50 billion for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, more than $43 billion of it is administered through the two existing state revolving funds. And that's the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which is a financial assistance program to help water systems and states achieve the health protection objectives of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and is often used to improve water treatment, repair old pipes, and also improve the source of water supply. And then there's the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is a financial assistance program for a wide range of water infrastructure projects, including the creation of municipal wastewater facilities, controlling non-point sources of pollution, and green infrastructure, just to name a few. But how they work is a little bit easier to describe in a flow chart, but let me try to paint a picture for you. So Congress appropriates funding for the SRFs, and then EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, will then award capitalization grants to each state based on the allotment formula for each SRF, with the state providing a certain percentage of matching funds. States are responsible for the operation of their SRF programs. They may set specific loan terms, including interest rates from 0% to market rate and repayment periods of up to 30 years. States really have the flexibility to target financial resources to their specific community and environmental needs, and may also customize those loan terms to meet the needs of small and disadvantaged communities, or even to provide incentives for certain types of projects. They function very much like an environmental infrastructure bank by providing low-interest loans to eligible recipients for clean water and drinking water infrastructure projects. And as money is paid back into the state's SRF, the state then can make new loans to other recipients for high-priority water quality activities. Repayments of that loan principal and interest earnings are recycled back into the individual state SRF programs to finance new projects that allow the funds to be revolved at the state level over time.
Well, that's fascinating. I think probably a lot of people don't understand how that works. So thank you for breaking that down for us. This is a lot of money. How are states going to receive it? What's the timing on this? I know that these things always are somewhat more complicated than we might assume.
Of course. So states aren't going to receive that $43 billion for the SRFs all at once. It's going to be split across FY 2022 to FY 2026. So that's a total of 5 years. And I won't speak to the lead service line or the PFAS and emerging contaminant funding, as you'll hear from Alan on that. But for the supplemental Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, states should anticipate the amount they're set to receive based on those existing allotment formulas. And those are going to increase for the first 2 years and then plateau for the next 3, with another caveat that for the funding via the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, the formula which identifies the amount that states will get is actually going to shift a little bit based on the release of a new EPA report derived from the 7th Drinking Water Needs Survey and Assessment. Funds are going to remain available for obligation to states for the fiscal year in which they are appropriated and the following fiscal year per the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So, for example, EPA is going to make the FY 2022 funds available for obligations to states during FY 2022 and FY 2023.
Let me ask you about matching funds. This is always a significant issue in any federal program. And I understand that on the 2 types of revolving funds, there's a 10% and then an increase to 20% matching funds for states. How are states going to meet these matches? Where's that money going to come from?
So it's certainly a hefty amount, especially when we're seeing some states being eligible to receive more funding than they've ever seen before. In the past, when Congress has substantially increased those SRF appropriations, for example, in the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, they've also waived that match requirement. And while Congress has done so for the lead service line and PFAS and emerging contaminant funding, they didn't do so for the supplemental SRFs. What Congress did do, however, is decrease that match requirement for the supplemental SRF funds to 10% from the traditional 20% for those first 2 years, and then increasing it back to 20% for those later 3 years. And while it's not as great as waiving the match entirely, it's still certainly beneficial for states in accessing those funds. In the past, states have used revenues from state taxes, fees, and retired bonds to make their match, although abilities for states to make that match may be constrained by budgets and commitments to other programs. I will note that the Department of Treasury did determine that funds from the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which were part of the American Rescues Plan, which were available for the provision of government services up to the amount of the state's reduction in revenue due to the COVID-19 pandemic, may be used to meet the non-federal match requirements of those supplemental Drinking Water State Revolving Funds and Clean Water State Revolving Fund programs. So there's hope that that will provide states with additional flexibility to meet those matching requirements in the IIJA.
Well, it does sound like there's going to have to be a little innovative thinking at the state level to come up with that. We're now at the end of April in 2022, and I wonder, what do you think? Can states expect to receive any of this funding before the end of the year, for example?
So great question. In early March, EPA unveiled its SRF implementation memo, which outlined a strategy for collaborative implementation with state, local, and tribal partners for that $53 billion in water infrastructure funding flowing through the SRFs. At this point in time, states should be focused on soliciting project applications and funding the source of the state match for that 10% amount. Once states do that, then they will develop their intended use plans, solicit public comment, and submit their application to EPA, which will then review those intended use plans before dispersing the funds. Once those steps are complete, it's likely that funds should start to roll out sometime in the mid-fall of 2022, although that may push to December of 2022.
Well, that sounds still within the year, so that seems fast by federal standards. As we get ready to wrap up, let me ask you about the role of legislatures in handling these funds and associated projects. How much of a role does the legislature have?
Now, SRFs have been the foundation of water infrastructure investments, providing low-cost financing for local projects across the United States. An effective partnership between the federal government and states in deploying these funds is really going to be essential to unlocking their full potential. The SRFs provide states the flexibility to address water infrastructure challenges within their communities, both in program administration and processes. States themselves have the flexibility to determine priorities and select projects, design and manage the application process, transfer funds between the programs to address state need, and set interest rates and repayment terms, and define disadvantaged communities, just to name a few. The role of the legislature is going to differ in each state, although one thing is certain, most, if not all, are going to have to appropriate those matching dollars, and some may have to approve budget increases to provide a match, which may need state legislative approval. If a legislature chooses to, they can enact legislation defining communities. They can require a certain number of water infrastructure projects focused in a particular area, or even require an additional report or two from the agency in charge of administering their state revolving funds, highlighting on how they're utilizing the increased level of funding. It's going to be really legislature dependent here.
Well, great, Kristen. Thank you so much for breaking this down. These issues are quite complicated, and it's good to have a guide. So thanks again, and take care.
Thank you, Ed.
I'll be back right after this with Alan Roberson from the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators.
Rely on state legislatures' news on the NCSL website for the freshest takes on people, places, and policy. Find out what states are doing about the biggest issues of the day, and check out the Across the Aisle and My District features for compelling stories of bipartisanship and special places and events. Make SLN your daily go-to for all the hottest legislative topics and trends. Just click on the News tab on the NCSL website, www.ncsl.org.
I'm back with Alan Roberson, the Executive Director of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad you invited me.
Earlier in the podcast, I talked with Kristen Hildreth at NCSL about elements of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that affect water projects. She mentioned there's a significant amount of funding states have not seen before, including money for lead service line replacement and emerging contaminants. Can you talk about why that's significant to states and localities?
Well, the first major point is it's just so much money. Over a 5-year window, it's a total of about $43 billion. And in the past, the 5-year amount you might get in the state revolving loan fund would be closer to $5 or $6 billion. So it's just, it's not quite an order of magnitude, but say 7 or 8 times what we normally get in a 5-year window. So you have this big funnel of money passing through the states to go to water systems. Because of all that money, then they're able to focus on, 3 kind of main areas. One is a traditional state revolving loan fund for more traditional infrastructure. It could be drinking water plants, it could be tanks, it could be distribution system pipes, just that fund is going to increase over that 5-year window. It's about $11.7 billion. And then you've got two new pots of money. One you talked about was lead service line replacement. So now there's $15 billion, $3 billion a year, each year for 5 years. And then another $4 billion for emerging contaminants, primarily focusing on PFAS. That's sort of the class that sort of was the driver for this. And with the lead service line, we really think it'll push everybody along on getting the lead out. Say getting the lead out, it means taking the lead service lines out from the main in the street all the way through the building wall or slab to the wall of the house or the slab. That removes a significant source of lead exposure in drinking water. The way you start that process is you do inventories first. You have to identify where they are. The records can vary quite a bit in systems as to what they have for knowledge of what materials are on the service line. And we're dealing with both a public side of the line, which is in the right-of-way of the street, and what's on private property. So there's a lot of systems that have, some knowledge about what is publicly owned, but maybe very little about what the plumber put in when they built the house. And so this will drive both the development of inventories for 70,000 water systems across the country, and they're replacing the lead where they find it in a fairly large number there too. We're just not sure how many yet.
So I know in the infrastructure bill generally, there's a lot of situations where matching funds are required from states. Does that apply to these two instances, the contaminants issue and the lead service line replacement?
Well, it varies, and that's kind of a tradition of the state revolving funds, is that Congress thinks it's helpful for the states to have some skin in the game, to put in some money, to ensure appropriate oversight and other details that the states know best. And so in the past, the state revolving fund would have a 20% match. So what Congress did is, with this big increase, they said, okay, for the first 2 years, we're dropping that percentage down to 10. And in the last 3 years, they're bumping it back up to 20. Now, that's just that pot of money, what we're calling the traditional SRF. For the lead service lines and for the PFAS or emerging contaminants, it's zero. There is no state match for that. And that's really more, I guess, from the public health perspective. I mean, it's all about public health anyway. But these are two really pressing public health issues, two that have gotten a lot of publicity in the last 3 or 4, 5 years. You think about Flint and lead service lines. You think about Hoosick Falls and other sites with PFAS contamination. People know about them. And so there's been movies made and books written. And so now, with this additional funding, this really significant increase in funding, I think we are going to make a big dent in taking out the lead service lines, treating for PFAS, and then also just generally increasing the quality of the drinking water infrastructure across the country.
Well, I think you're right about public awareness. The story about what happened in Flint received massive coverage. And I know here in Colorado, the PFAS issue came up because of water contamination south of Colorado Springs, where firefighting foam was used by the military.
Yeah, what they found with these forever chemicals, the PFAS chemicals, is that initially we thought it would just be the manufacturing facilities, and they're several scattered throughout the country. And then it went to the Air Force firefighting foam, and then that even broadened into fire training academies and a lot of other facilities that we didn't know about. And then they found sites from different kind of production. There's a site up in Michigan that was from a shoe manufacturer, where it was a common product for waterproofing, which is, again, how I first heard about these was, Scotchgard and Stainmaster back in the day. And so there's just a lot of new sources that keep coming up. And that's just, again, like you said, the site, the Air Force Base near Colorado Springs, was one of the early ones when we first started sampling for these.
So let me go back to the lead water lines. This has been a challenge for states and the federal government. It's not like they haven't been trying to do something about this. How much of a difference will this level of money make?
I think it's going to make a huge difference. I think, again, it's a two-step process. You have to identify where you have lead service lines, and if it's unknown, then take some steps to determine if it is lead or not. You can dig holes. There are other ways to try and do that, modeling and other means to try and determine if there's lead there or not. So you're going to be able to inventory, and then really you want to try and use the bulk of the money for replacements. The cost can vary significantly. Newark was able to do it for about $7,000 a line because they had an assembly line process. The city was able to pass an ordinance to allow the city and the contractors to go on private property to replace the lines because they had a majority of the residents that were renters. And so there was a problem getting hold of the landlords. The city passed the ordinance, and they just go down the block and blow through all the service lines. But you go to some areas and they have to move around. It can be $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a service line. So having this money will make a big difference in the number of lines you can replace. There's also this issue that we have to sort through is the requirements. Right now under the current lead and copper rule, you only have to replace 3% of the lines when you have what's known as an action level exceedance. EPA is looking at maybe changing that. They finalized the rule last year. They're looking at doing a set of improvements that may have mandatory requirements. But there are a lot of utilities out there that are progressive and are going to want to do it anyway, or their customers are going to want them to do it. You've seen that in D.C., you've seen that in Cincinnati, Newark, all kinds of cities. Denver is doing a big lead service line replacement. And so I think that's going to be the drivers of cities that want to take advantage of this free money will do replacements because they had the access to the money and their customers are going to want it.
Yeah, let me ask you about that lead and copper rule. Is that likely to find a lot more states coming into compliance, or as you're saying, maybe that's still unclear?
I think it's still unclear to a degree. I think there will be more systems that will have compliance problems with the new rule, given some of their sampling requirements. They want you to sample where you have lead service lines. And so I think as more lines are found, they'll be sampling more often from locations that have lead service lines, and that's going to knock systems out of compliance and require replacements. The states are going to have to do a lot of work to implement this rule. Right now, they're in the process of looking at their intended use plan. So to get this money, they have to have an overall plan for each project, how much it's going to cost, and do a prioritization scheme. So they're having to modify those to take into account this new lead service line money and the emerging contaminants money. And they're going to have to review all the grant applications. So there's going to be a lot of work just to sort of work through that process. And then on the lead side, they're going to have to review and approve all the inventories. Similar for any treatment that's put in for PFAS or the other emerging contaminants, they're going to have to review and approve the treatment that's installed to ensure that it works as it's designed. Reviewing all these grant applications, the inventories, the treatment plans, and then tracking everything. The federal government's going to want to see results. They're going to want to know how many lead service lines have been replaced on an annual basis. States are hard at work developing data management systems to be able to put all this together and track it and report it so both the federal government and the public knows what's being done with this money.
So to go back to the emerging contaminants, some states have taken some action around mitigating the effects. Some have had health guidelines. They've set contaminant levels, that sort of thing. What do you think that the states will end up doing with this new money? What will the most likely courses of action be?
I think there's a few things. As you said, a lot of states have already done monitoring, and a handful have set their own standards, again, because their consumers in that state demanded it. They did not want to wait for EPA to set national standards. Now, EPA is in the process of doing that, but these states, their constituents wanted the states to move faster. So more states are doing monitoring now, and this money will probably even have more monitoring done. But a lot of water systems are going to do monitoring required by EPA starting in January. In January of next year, we'll have about 12,000 systems monitor for 29 different PFAS. And that'll really develop robust occurrence data more robust occurrence data. We already have some. This will be a broader scan across the country. From that, the bulk of the money is going to be used to put in treatment where it's needed. And that's really, I think, the primary source is that the treatment to remove these forever chemicals, it's expensive to build, and it's also expensive to operate and maintain. Typically, you have these large steel tanks that have some kind of absorbent media in them. The water goes through that, and it takes out the PFAS chemicals. So there's an issue there in just the capital cost to build the tanks and the pipes and the valves and the pumps to make it work. But then you also have to change the media on a regular basis, that at some point the absorptive capacity of the media is gone. and you have to replace it with fresh media. So there's an operating cost that the utilities have to cover themselves. So that operating cost cannot use the federal money. It has to come from the rate base. So that's one issue that our states are going to have to work with, is to make sure the systems are sustainable. In other words, the systems have a decent enough rate base that they can pay for the maintenance, the media change out on a regular basis. Typically also, when you put in that kind of advanced treatment, you need a higher grade operator. And so there's an issue there with making sure that you have the person that has the knowledge and the skills to operate that advanced treatment. Typically is going to cost more money for that operator. So again, you're back to financial sustainability of the system. And then another issue that we're still sorting out is that then what do you do with that spent media? You've taken it out of the vessel, you have it in a truck. You just don't want to put that in a landfill and then create a landfill problem with the leachate and the groundwater. There's some promising technologies on very high temperature destruction. That's the ideal way, is you break the bonds in these complex organic chemicals, and you don't have the problematic chemicals anymore. That technology is still evolving, but that seems to be the long-term solution. So I think how systems dispose of the media is going to be an issue that's still to be determined. And because if you have to take it to a hazardous chemical disposal site, your disposal costs are a lot more. And again, that just continues to increase that operating and maintenance cost. So again, I think the bulk of the money is going to go to treatment.
Well, speaking of money, how do states get this money? Is this accessible now? How do they go about pulling down these funds?
Well, not surprisingly, it's a little bit of a complicated process. And I mentioned earlier the term intended use plans, and that's a starting point. They develop the plan, and they have a prioritization scheme. They have a ranking criteria, and then they total it as they go down. And when they know what their allotments are going to be, EPA has a formula for determining how much goes to each state based on population and the number of water systems, with a 1% minimum for the very small states. So they know what they're going to get, and when they hit that, then they submit that to EPA. EPA reviews and approves the intended use plans. That's a starting point. States get the grant applications from the systems. Those get reviewed and approved, and then EPA transfers the money to the states. The states then are in charge of managing the money. So they don't turn around necessarily and just give it all the water system. They give progress funds as progress are being made, and typically it's done on a monthly construction draw. So every month, the contractor for the facilities will submit something to the state, and they'll get reimbursed that way. So then the state holds the money while the project is being built and doles it out every month to match the progress of the construction. So the short answer to your question is no, they don't have the money yet. So I kind of gave a long answer, but they'll get the money soon. And in fact, the EPA is targeting to disperse all the money by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. So again, states are in this, really busy time of trying to develop these intended use plans. And in that, they get sort of a basic grant application, and then working with the systems to get the full grant application. Because unfortunately, with federal money, any kind of money, there's a lot of paperwork. And so they're already working with the systems to make sure that everyone knows how to fill out all that paperwork, particularly when you're trying to work with smaller systems or disadvantaged communities. You have to hold their hand a little bit and provide some technical assistance on all the paperwork and the forms in order to get that application done properly, get it approved, and get the money out the door to the system.
Well, I think we're going to wind it up there, and I want to thank you for your time and say take care.
Well, yeah, thank you for the invitation. Again, it's an exciting time to be working in water because of all this federal funding and all the issues that we're grappling with. So thanks again.
And that concludes this episode of our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate NCSL podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Legislatures, The Inside Story, and the special series, Building Democracy. Thanks for listening.